Hi everyone, welcome to the final week of intermediate logic for the semester. So I'm going to be taking you through a few final ideas on the module, which is going to broaden out our view a little bit. We've been looking at how to use the different systems that we've worked through so far, but now we're actually going to think a little bit about some broader questions where we might question those systems. For those of you who are thinking about or have signed up for advanced logic, this might be a little bit of a look forward to see what kinds of things you might expect. When you go on to advanced logic, you will be looking more at justifying the rules that you introduce and how you use the system as you go along, but you're also going to introduce some thinking about how to question the systems we use and how to potentially propose alternatives. So that's something we're going to do a quick run through of today. But we'll start just by introducing ourselves to the topic. So our topic for today is going to be bivalence and the law of excluded middle. Those are going to be our focus, but let's just start by thinking about what it means to ask questions about our logic. So on the module, we have looked at three different systems, although of course they are all related to one another. We started by thinking about propositional logic. So propositional logic took these atomic sentences, these primitive sentence letters, and we learned a number of different ways about how to combine them together appropriately using our connectives. And then we learned how to manipulate those, how to reason with them, and how to check for valid arguments. We then looked at modal logic, specifically modal propositional logic. So we took what we'd started with and we introduced the box and diamond symbols. We only got a short way along being able to articulate how we use these, but they allow us to do some reasoning involving necessity and possibility and a whole bunch of other stuff. Okay, but that just added those two symbols into our existing language. We then looked at first order logic. First order logic looked at breaking apart sentences a little bit further than propositional logic was able to. Okay, rather than just working with primitive sentences, we started thinking about predicates and constants, variables and quantifiers, okay, splitting up these sentences into smaller chunks. Now, these three systems allow us to represent lots of different examples of reasoning. Okay, they let us think about a lot of cases about where we can ask, is this a valid argument, or is this a tautology? But do they capture everything we can do with logic? Well, definitely not. There is way more that we can ask about. One thing that we might do is we might combine modal logic and first order logic. Okay, so we only looked at how we use the box and diamond symbols and how they affect the way that propositional logic works. But we can also do modal first order logic. Okay, we can bring in predicates and quantifiers into how we do our modal logic. And that raises certain interesting different questions. But that's an area that a lot of people find really interesting because it allows us to do a lot more reasoning. Another use we might have for modal logic in particular is to develop specific systems for example, deontic logic. So that's the logic of what is permissible and what is not permissible. Or epistemic logic, where we're talking about the nature of belief and knowledge. Or tense logic, where we're thinking about what things are true in the future or in the past, and so on. We really briefly touched on the fact that we can use our modal symbolism to express these before, but there's a lot more to be done to think about what particular systems, what axioms and that sort of thing can we use for each of these different logics. Okay, all of those things are extensions of our logic, right? They're ways of adding new symbols in, or adding new principles in to allow us to get new kinds of answer, allow us to represent more things. Somewhat like the step from propositional logic into first order logic, where we allow ourselves to express more. But today, what I want us to think about for a bit is some revisions to our logic. So in particular, the systems we've all discussed fall within what we call classical logic, and we'll cover what that means in a minute. Classical logic is the logic that is assumed by most people when they're doing philosophy, by most people when they're doing basic logic. It's the most popular way of thinking about how logic works, and there's good reason for that, but there are also reasons to raise questions about it. Okay, the way to think about this is the rules that we used at the beginning, the definitions of our symbols and the inference rules we allowed ourselves gave us a certain set of tautologies. Okay, those are the sentences that always get the value true, and theorems. Theorems are the sentences that we can prove on the basis of no premises whatsoever. But we might ask, what if, when we look at our language, we think there's something wrong with what we've got? So we look at a tautology or a theorem. It's worth noting that the tautologies and the theorems are the same. It turns out, we didn't get the chance to prove this, but you can, that any tautology is a theorem, any theorem is a tautology in the systems that we have given. But suppose we see one of those and we think, I don't think that should be a tautology or a theorem. Based on something that I see out in the world, some reasoning I do about the world, I might think, actually, this shouldn't be in our system. Now, if we do find something like this, we can't just revise things ad hoc, and we'll kind of see why in a bit. But the basic reason is that the parts of our system all relate to each other. Okay, they all have important relations with one another, and if you just take one part out, you might break another proof that you want to use. Or the other problem you might find is you try to take one part out and it turns out that actually you can still prove the same stuff using a different principle. Okay, that would be almost kind of the opposite problem. So you think you can save your logic from some awkward conclusion by saying, I'm not going to accept this principle, but it turns out you already have the principles that make that thing true anyway. So you've actually kind of taken the wrong bit out of your logic. So if we are going to raise questions about our logic, then we have to be quite careful about the impact it has when we try to remove some particular principle, some particular idea. We have to do some quite creative things a lot of the time to actually make things still work. So we're going to look at one particular area where we might want to make revisions and some of the challenges that come up if we do so. Okay, and that's going to be to do with bivalence and the law of excluded middle. And we're going to look at only a couple of ways that you might actually try to think again about how we work with these principles.